The structural integrity of a $10,000 champagne tower relies entirely on the stability of the bottom tier, much like the precarious reputation of the Prescott family. I watched the golden liquid cascade down the pyramid of crystal flutes with the detached scrutiny of a structural engineer rather than a party planner. My headset buzzed with 3 different voices screaming about ice shortages, but I ignored them to focus on the task at hand, which was theft. With the practiced sleight of hand of a magician, I tilted a half-empty bottle of Dom Perignon toward a plastic water bottle hidden in the deep pocket of my blazer. The rich, yeasty aroma of vintage champagne clashed with the stale sweat of the service corridor. This was not for me. My mother claimed only premium French bubbles soothed her high blood pressure, and since my salary had been garnished for the 3rd time this month, stealing the dregs from the rich was the only way to keep the peace at home. I capped the water bottle and checked my clipboard. Sloane Prescott, 32 years old, head of operations at the Prescott Hotel, and basically a glorified servant in the kingdom my grandfather built. I stepped out from behind the velvet curtain and scanned the ballroom where 500 guests mingled under chandeliers that cost more than my life insurance policy. Zero margin for error. A heavy hand suddenly landed on my lower back and slid downward with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. I stiffened but did not flinch. The smell of bourbon and expensive cologne assaulted my senses as a man in a tuxedo leaned in too close. He was Mr. Sterling, a donor whose name was on the brass plaque in the lobby, and whose hands were currently violating Code 7 of the guest conduct policy. Without breaking eye contact or raising my voice, I took a precise step back and firmly removed his hand from my hip. "Sir, you are blocking the fire exit route." I said. My voice was flat and devoid of the fear he wanted to see. "Please return to your table or I will have security escort you out for liability reasons." He blinked, surprised by the cold splash of regulations. Before he could escalate, my manager, Mr. Henderson, materialized. He was a weasel of a man who owed his job to my mother's nepotism. He grabbed my arm and pulled me into the kitchen shadows, his face purple with rage. "You do not speak to Mr. Sterling like that," Henderson hissed. "You embarrassed him. That comes out of your check, Sloane. $200. I looked at him, calculating the damage. $200 was my grocery budget for the entire month. Logic dictated I argue. I knew the labor laws. I knew the harassment policies. But I also knew that one phone call from Henderson to my mother would result in a week of emotional warfare I did not have the energy to fight. "Understood," I said quietly. I adjusted my earpiece and walked away, my stomach growling in protest against the injustice, but my face remaining a mask of perfect obedient indifference. The transition from the polished marble floors of the hotel to the cracked linoleum of my apartment was jarring enough to give anyone whiplash. My apartment was a shoebox in a neighborhood where police sirens were background noise, but it was mine, and it was orderly. I placed the plastic bottle of stolen champagne in the fridge next to a single container of yogurt. I was about to calculate how many days I could survive on dry pasta when the front door rattled violently. My heart hammered against my ribs until I saw the face in the peephole. It was Jace. My brother looked like he had run a marathon in a suit 2 sizes too small. I unlocked the door and he pushed past me, bringing the cold night air and the scent of panic into my sanctuary. "Jace, what are you doing here?" I asked, locking the door behind him. He was pacing my tiny kitchen, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. "I just need to crash Sloane just for a few hours, okay?" he stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead with a trembling hand. He was clutching something in his fist. I watched him scanning my counters, his gaze landing on the row of glass jars where I kept my dry goods labeled and organized by expiration date. Before I could stop him, he unscrewed the lid of the rice jar and shoved a small black object deep into the grains. "What was that?" I asked, my voice sharp. Jace turned to me and grabbed my shoulders, his fingers digging into my skin. "Nothing, just old school stuff. Listen to me, Sloane. Do not let anyone in here. Not the landlord, not the cops, and definitely not Mom. Do you understand?" The intensity in his eyes terrified me. Jace was a gambler and a liar, but he had never looked this scared. Before I could demand an explanation, his phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, turned pale, and backed away toward the door. "I have to go. Don't touch the rice." He vanished as quickly as he had arrived, leaving me standing in the silence of my kitchen. I stared at the door for a full minute, analyzing the probability of him being in trouble versus him just being dramatic. The probability of trouble was 90%. I sighed and walked over to the counter. My need for order overrode my fear. I could not leave a foreign object contaminating my food supply. I plunged my hand into the cold white rice, and my fingers closed around a small metallic rectangle. It was a USB drive, black and nondescript. I turned it over in my hand. Part of me managed crises for a living wanted to plug it in and investigate. But the exhaustion of a 14-hour shift and the weight of the day pressed down on me. It was probably just illegal gambling software or pirated movies. I didn't have the mental bandwidth to deal with Jace's mess tonight. I walked over to the junk drawer in the hallway, the only chaotic space I allowed myself. I tossed the USB drive into a plastic bin labeled Lost and Found, along with spare buttons and dead batteries. I closed the drawer, shutting away the mystery. I had work in 6 hours, and chaos was a luxury I could not afford. 3 days later, the air at the Prescott estate was thick enough to choke on. It was Grandfather Harold's 80th birthday, and the mansion was filled with people who hoped he would die soon so they could carve up his empire. I stood in front of the hallway mirror while my mother, Patricia, adjusted my collar. She smelled of Chanel and deception. "Here, put these on," she said, handing me a pair of plastic pearl earrings. "But I have my own." I started to protest, reaching for the modest gold studs I had saved for months to buy. "No," my mother snapped, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Those look too expensive. We need to look humble, Sloan. We need him to think we are struggling, so he understands why we need more support. Do not ruin this for me." I swallowed my pride and put on the cheap plastic jewelry. It scratched my earlobes. We walked into the grand library, where Grandfather Harold sat in his wheelchair like a king on a throne of mahogany. He looked frail, his skin like parchment paper, but his eyes were sharp, clear, and terrifyingly lucid. He waved the other guests away until only the family remained. Patricia immediately launched into her performance, clasping her hands and widening her eyes. "Daddy, you look wonderful," she cooed. "We have been so worried. The bills are piling up, and poor Sloan here works herself to the bone." Grandfather raised a hand, silencing her. He did not look at her. He looked at me. "Sloan came here," he commanded. I stepped forward, my hands clasped behind my back in my usual stance of deference. His gaze bore into me, dissecting me. I saw a flicker of something in his eyes that I could not place. Disappointment, betrayal. "Is $5,000 a month enough for you?" he asked quietly. The room went deadly silent. I blinked, my brain trying to process the data. "Excuse me, Grandfather," I asked, thinking I had misheard. He slammed a folder onto the desk, dust motes dancing in the light. "The accounting report, Sloan. I see the transfers, $5,000 every month wired directly to an account in your name. You claim to be dutiful, you claim to work hard, yet you siphon money from the company while the hotel profits are bleeding out. Why do you need so much money?" I felt the blood drain from my face. My logical mind raced through my bank statements, my pay stubs, and my empty savings account. There was no such money. There never had been. "Grandfather," I said, my voice trembling slightly but ringing with the absolute conviction of truth. "I do not know what you are talking about. My take-home pay is $800 a week. I have never received a penny more. I have never stolen from you." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Grandfather stared at me, searching for the lie. Slowly, the realization dawned on his face. His eyes shifted from my confused expression to my mother, who was standing by the window. Patricia was trembling, not with fear for me, but with the terror of exposure. "You," rasped his voice, rising in fury as he pointed a shaking finger at his daughter. "It was you. You used her name." Patricia, panic-stricken, lunged forward. "Daddy, no," she shrieked, feigning a stumble. She crashed into the side table, sending a carafe of water and a heavy crystal vase shattering onto the floor. The noise was explosive. "Daddy, calm down your heart," she screamed, creating chaos to drown out the truth. But it was too late. Grandfather gasped, clutching his chest, his face turning an alarming shade of gray. The monitor on his wrist began to wail, a high-pitched scream that signaled the end of everything I thought I knew. I stood frozen amidst the broken glass, watching the only man I respected collapse under the weight of a betrayal I was just beginning to understand. The antiseptic smell of the emergency room waiting area was a sharp contrast to the expensive perfume my mother had bathed in before the party, but the toxicity remained the same. Doctors and nurses moved in a blurred radius around the stretcher, where Grandfather lay unconscious, his face obscured by an oxygen mask. I stood near the wall with my arms wrapped around myself, trying to calculate the probability of his survival based on his age and medical history. I was running numbers to keep from feeling the crushing weight of guilt. Before I could finish the equation, Patricia crossed the distance between us. She did not look like a grieving daughter. She looked like a predator whose trap had been sprung too early. She raised her hand, and the sound of her palm striking my cheek echoed through the sterile hallway louder than the heart monitors. "You greedy little witch," she screamed, her voice cracking perfectly for the audience of medical staff and curious onlookers. "You just had to ask him for money while he was dying. Are you happy now? Is this what you wanted?" My cheek burned, but the physical pain was irrelevant compared to the sudden dissonance in my mind. I stared at the floor, counting the scuff marks on the linoleum. Her narrative was compelling. It made sense. I had spoken about money. He had collapsed. Cause and effect. Doubt began to creep in like a virus. Maybe I had been too blunt. Maybe I had misunderstood the question. I felt the familiar urge to apologize, to fix the disruption and restore order. I opened my mouth to say I was sorry, but then I replayed the data in my head. I rewound the memory of the library. Grandfather had not been looking at me with disgust when he fell. He had been looking at her. His eyes held the specific heartbreak of a man realizing his own flesh and blood had cannibalized him. The logic of my mother's accusation did not hold up against the evidence of that gaze. I closed my mouth and straightened my spine. "Mrs. Prescott, that is enough." The voice was baritone and brooked no argument. It was Arthur Archer, grandfather's personal attorney. He stepped out of a private consultation room, looking as if he had slept in his suit, yet remained impeccably sharp. He did not look at my mother, he looked at me. Harold anticipated this possibility. He said, his tone devoid of sentiment. He executed a durable power of attorney and a temporary guardianship directive 3 days ago, in the event of his incapacitation. Control of the Prescott estate and the hotel operations does not revert to next of kin. Patricia stopped crying instantly, her tear-stained face hardening into stone. "What are you talking about, Arthur? I am his daughter, and Sloan is his designated guardian." Archer continued, handing me a thick envelope. "Effective immediately, all financial assets are frozen pending an internal audit. Sloan, you are to assume the role of acting CEO until Harold recovers. Patricia, you are restricted from the premises and from any company accounts." My mother looked at me with a hatred so pure, it felt radioactive, but she knew better than to argue with Archer in a room full of witnesses. She turned on her heel and stormed out, the click of her heels sounding like gunshots. I looked down at the envelope in my hands. I did not feel like a victor. I felt like someone who had just been handed the keys to a burning building. The executive suite on the top floor of the Prescott Hotel was a mausoleum of mahogany and leather that smelled of cigars and old decisions. I walked in the next morning wearing my same gray suit, but the atmosphere had shifted. The secretaries who usually ignored me now stared openly, their whispers stopping abruptly as I passed. They did not respect me. They saw a glorified waitress playing dress-up in her grandfather's chair. I sat behind the massive desk, feeling dwarfed by the furniture and the responsibility. My first order of business was to find the leak. Grandfather had mentioned $5,000 a month. That money had to go somewhere. I unlocked the bottom drawer of the desk using the key Archer had given me. Inside, tucked beneath a stack of quarterly reports, was a leather-bound ledger. It was not the official company books. It was a chaotic collection of receipts and handwritten notes. I flipped through the pages and my heart sank. The receipts were from casinos in Las Vegas and Atlantic City. Tens of thousands of dollars in markers signed by Jace Prescott, but guaranteed by the Prescott Family Trust. I sat back, exhaling a breath I didn't know I was holding. The logic aligned. Jace had a gambling problem. My mother, being the enabler she was, had been siphoning money to cover his debts to keep him from being killed by loan sharks. It was a violation of fiduciary duty, but it was not malice. It was a mother protecting her son. It was pathetic and illegal, but it was human. I felt a strange sense of relief. I could fix this. I could set up a payment plan so I could get Jace into rehab. I was categorizing the problem into a solvable box when the intercom buzzed. "Mr. Callahan is here to see you, Mrs. Prescott," the assistant said, her voice dripping with skepticism. "He says he has an appointment." I checked the calendar. There was no appointment, but Reed Callahan was not a man who waited for invitations. He was the CEO of the Horizon Group, our direct competitor, and a man known for acquiring distressed properties and gutting them for parts. He walked into the office before I could answer. He was younger than I expected, sharp-featured, and wearing a suit that cost more than my entire education. He did not offer his hand. He sat down opposite me and placed a single file folder on the desk. "I will make this quick, Sloan," he said, using my first name, with a familiarity I had not granted him. "Everyone knows Prescott is underwater. The vultures are circling. I am offering you a lifeline. I'll buy the hotel, including the debt, for $40 million. It is a generous exit strategy for a waitress who is in over her head." My spine stiffened. He had done his research, but his data was flawed. I opened the folder he slid across the desk. It was a valuation report thick with charts and projections. I scanned the numbers with my eyes skipping over the boilerplate text to the financial tables. I stopped on page 4. I looked closer. Then I looked up at him. Your valuation model is incorrect, I said, my voice steady. Reed blinked the first crack in his arrogant veneer. Excuse me, you are using a liquidation valuation based on the current distressed assets, I explained, tapping the page with my index finger. But you failed to account for the historical tax credits associated with the landmark status of the building's facade, which were renewed last month. That adds approximately 12% to the net asset value. Furthermore, you calculated the debt service coverage ratio based on last quarter's revenue, which was artificially suppressed by the renovation of the ballroom. Adjusted for seasonal normalization, the cash flow is 20% higher than your projection. Your offer is not generous, Mr. Callahan. It is predatory and mathematically insulting. Reed stared at me. The dismissal in his eyes evaporated, replaced by a sudden sharp curiosity. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked at the file, then back at me. You are not just the party planner, are you? I am the person who knows where every penny in this building comes from and where it is supposed to go, I replied, closing the folder and sliding it back to him. And I am not selling, not today. Reed smiled. It was not a nice smile, but it was a respectful one. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. You are right, the hotel is worth more, but you have a cash flow problem that tax credits cannot fix in the short term. You have a leak in your ship's loan, and I think you know it is bigger than just a few renovations. He paused at the door, his hand on the brass knob. I want this hotel, but I do not want to buy a crime scene. If you let me bring in my own forensic accounting team to do a shadow audit, I will help you find where the money is really going. If the books are clean, I will pay fair market value. If they are not, you will need an ally who knows how to restructure debt before the federal investigators show up. I looked at Jace's gambling receipts on my desk, then at the shark standing in my doorway. I needed resources I did not have. I needed someone who could see through the chaos. Deal, I said. But if your team leaks a single number to the press, I will bury you in litigation so deep you will need a submarine to find your way out. Reed laughed with a genuine sound of amusement. I look forward to Ms. Prescott. See you at 8 tomorrow. He left the room, and for the first time that day, I felt the distinct click of a plan falling into place. I had a temporary ally, and I had a theory. I just prayed that the gambling debts were the extent of the rot, because if they were not, I was standing on a foundation that was already crumbling. The conference room smelled of stale coffee and impending doom. It was 3 a.m, and the only light came from the glow of laptops and the city skyline bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Reed Callahan sat at the head of the table, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms that looked like they could strangle a bear or a board of directors. He was not looking at me with the predatory amusement he had displayed yesterday. He was looking at me with something far worse, which was pity. He slid a single piece of paper across the mahogany surface. It was not a gambling marker. It was a certificate of incorporation for a company called SP Global Logistics, registered in Delaware 3 years ago. I picked up the paper, my fingers numb. I scanned the document. The address was a post office box in the Cayman Islands. The stated capital was negligible, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. It was my signature. The loops on the S and the sharp cross on the T were perfect. It was the signature I used for vendor contracts, for payroll authorizations, and for every mundane administrative task I had performed for the last decade. But I had never signed this document. Keep reading, Reed said, his voice low and rough. There are 2 more, Prescott Consulting and SP Ventures. Between the 3 of them, they have taken out loans totaling $5 million from private equity lenders. The collateral is your grandfather's personal stock portfolio, and the guarantor is you, Sloan. I felt the room tilt. The logic in my brain tried to reject the data, but the evidence was physical and damning. I looked at the dates. The first company was opened the week I started managing the payroll system. The loans were taken out incrementally, always just under the threshold that would trigger an automatic federal audit. This was not the sloppy desperation of a gambling addict like Jace. This was architectural. This was a blueprint. I did not sign these, I whispered, but even to my own ears, I sounded guilty. Reed leaned forward. I know you didn't. The timestamps on the digital filings match the dates you were hospitalized for pneumonia 2 years ago and the week you were coordinating the charity gala last year. You were physically incapable of being in the Cayman Islands, but legally that signature is yours. Someone lifted it from internal documents and traced it. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was not just about money. My mother had not just stolen from the company, she had stolen my identity. She had been building a cage for me for 3 years. Every time she asked me to sign a blank invoice, every time she praised my attention to detail, She was gathering the nails to seal my coffin. I was not her daughter. I was her scapegoat. I was the fail-safe she had engineered to take the fall when the house of cards finally collapsed. The moral order I had clung to the belief that if I followed the rules and protected my family, I would be safely dissolved into ash. I sat there stripped of my duty, leaving only a hollow, terrifying void where my purpose used to be. The transition from the silent horror of the boardroom to the chaotic violence of the lobby the next morning was instantaneous. I stepped out of the elevator intending to confront the legal department, but I was met by a wall of noise. The flat-screen televisions mounted above the reception desk were all tuned to a local gossip channel. A grainy photo filled the screen. It was me walking out of a restaurant with Reed late last night. My head bent low against the wind. The headline screamed, "The Black Widow of Prescott sells out family legacy for illicit affair." The image had been cropped and manipulated to make it look like we were embracing. A murmur rippled through the lobby. I looked around. The bellhops, the concierge, the receptionist, people whose schedules I managed, whose overtime I approved, were staring at me with open hostility. They did not see a manager. They saw a traitor who was sleeping with the enemy while their jobs hung in the balance. A traitor's voice shouted. I turned just as a raw egg struck the lapel of my gray blazer. The shell shattered the yolk, sliding down the fabric like yellow slime. I gasped not from pain, but from the sheer disorder of the act. It was a violation of the uniform and a breach of the code. A group of housekeeping staff stood near the entrance holding picket signs. Patricia had been busy. She had mobilized the workforce against me, painting me as the villain who was selling the hotel to Reed to pay off my secret debts. I stood there, the yolk staining my reputation, wiping it away with a trembling hand, but the stain remained. Security did not move to help me. I was alone. I fled. I pushed through the revolving doors and hailed a cab, my hands shaking so hard I could barely open the door. I needed sanctuary. I needed the one place where I could control the environment. But when I arrived at my apartment, the lock was hanging off the doorframe by a single screw. The air inside smelled of violence. My sanctuary had been desecrated. The sofa cushions were slashed, stuffing spilling out like entrails. My books and my carefully organized rows of classics were torn from the shelves and scattered across the floor. The drawers were pulled out and dumped. Jace. He had been looking for the USB drive. He had turned my orderly world into chaos in a desperate bid to save his own skin. I stepped over a broken lamp, the crunch of glass under my shoes echoing in the silence. I walked into the kitchen. The cabinets were open. The jars on the counter had been swept onto the floor. The large glass jar of rice lay shattered. Grains of white rice covered the linoleum like snow. I stared at the mess. My instinct, the core of who I was, demanded that I clean it up. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the glass shards that pressed into my skin. I began to sweep the rice into a pile. My movements are mechanical and jerky. Scoop, sweep, order from chaos. Then my fingers brushed against something hard and black. It sat there innocently among the white grains. The USB drive. Jace had been so violent in his search, so consumed by panic, that he had missed the very thing he came to destroy, because it had fallen amidst the debris he created. I picked it up. It felt heavy in my hand. I stood up and walked to my laptop, which lay on the floor, but miraculously screen intact. I sat amidst the ruin of my life and plugged it in. The folder contained spreadsheets, but there was also an audio file labeled insurance. I put on my headphones and pressed play. The waveform danced on the screen. The voice was unmistakable. It was my mother. Her tone was not the weeping victim the public saw, nor the nagging parent I knew. It was cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of love. "We cannot let the audit happen while Harold is alive," she said. Her voice was crystal clear. "But once the old man kicks the bucket, we dump the debt. We transfer the liability to the shell companies." A male voice laughed nervously, probably the crooked lawyer. "And Sloane, she is the signatory. She goes down for fraud. She is a soldier," Patricia replied, and I could hear the ice in her smile. "She will do what she is told, and if she fights it, who will believe her? She has no money, no friends, and her signature is on everything. She goes to prison, and we go to the Riviera. It is a mercy, really. She was born to serve a purpose, and this is it." I took off my headphones. The silence in the apartment was absolute. I did not cry. The time for tears had passed. The part of me that was a daughter died in that moment on the kitchen floor. What remained was something else entirely. I looked at the mess around me, the shattered glass, the ruined books, and the yolk stain on my jacket. They thought they had broken me. They thought they had reduced me to nothing, but they had made a fatal calculation error. They had stripped away my loyalty and left me with nothing but the cold, hard facts. and the facts stated that I was no longer the defendant. I was the prosecutor. Grandfather Harold died on a Tuesday morning at exactly 10:17. I knew the time because I was staring at the second hand of the wall clock in the hospital waiting room when the flatline tone began its monotonous drone. There was no chaotic rush of doctors this time, only the finality of silence. I stood up to go to him to pay my respects to the only family member who had ever seen me, but the door was blocked by two men in dark suits. They were not hospital security. They were private contractors. Behind them, my mother emerged from the room, dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. In her other hand, she held a document that looked crisp and new, contrasting sharply with the stale air of death. "It is a new will, Sloan," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of a guillotine. "Daddy signed it last night during a moment of clarity. He realized his mistake. He left everything to me. Everything." I looked at the paper she waved. From 3 feet away, I could see the signature. It was a jagged, erratic scrawl, barely legible, a desperate scratch of ink from a man whose hands had been shaking with Parkinsonian tremors for years. Or perhaps from a man whose hand had been guided by force. It was a forgery or a coerced instrument, but the legal validity of that moment was absolute. Arthur Archer stood behind her, looking pale and defeated. The document revoked his power of attorney. I was no longer the guardian. I was no longer the acting CEO. I was a trespasser. "You need to leave," my mother said, signaling the guards. "The funeral is for family and friends. You are neither. You are a liability. And by the way, the bank called. The first installment on those loans is due next week. $5 million. Good luck with that." The guards took my arms. I did not fight. Physics dictated that I would lose against two men twice my weight, so I walked. I walked out of the hospital, out of the life I had built, and into the rain that had begun to fall over the city. I was not just unemployed. I was destitute, disgraced, and liable for a debt that would bury me for 3 lifetimes. The logic of my existence had collapsed. 2 days later, I sat on the cold concrete steps of the 19th precinct. The rain had stopped, but the damp chill remained seeping through my thin coat. In my hands, I held a manila envelope. Inside was a signed confession taking full responsibility for the shell companies and the fraud. It was a lie, but it was a neat, orderly lie. If I turned myself in, the investigation would stop. The hotel would be safe from seizure. My mother would win, but the legacy grandfather built would survive, even if it was in the hands of a viper. It was the ultimate act of duty, the final sacrifice of a Type 1 personality trying to fix the world by destroying herself. I stood up, smoothing my skirt, preparing to walk through the glass doors and end my life as a free woman. A shadow fell over me. "That is a coward's way out, Sloan." I froze. I knew the voice. I turned to see Reed Callahan standing at the bottom of the steps. He was holding a black umbrella, though the sky was clear. He looked at the envelope in my hand, and then at my face. His expression was unreadable. "I am taking responsibility," I said. My voice was hoarse. "I am protecting the asset." "You are protecting a parasite," he countered, stepping closer. "You walk in there and she wins. You become the criminal she painted you to be, and she becomes the suffering saint who survived her daughter's betrayal. She gets the hotel, she gets the money, and you get 10 years in federal prison. Is that your version of justice?" "It is the only variable I can control," I argued, feeling the cracks in my resolve. "She has the will. She has the narrative. I have nothing. You have the truth," Reed said, pointing a gloved finger at my chest. "And you have anger. I see it. You are terrified of it because you think anger is messy. You think it violates your code. But right now, anger is the only fuel that will save you. Stop trying to be the good daughter. The good daughter is dead. She died in that kitchen when you found the recording." He was right. The logic was irrefutable. My adherence to rules, to the hierarchy of family, had been the very mechanism of my destruction. I looked at the precinct doors, then at the envelope. I thought about the signature on the will, the tremor in the ink. I thought about the champagne I had stolen to buy her medicine. I thought about the $5 million attached to my name like a shackle. A cold clarity washed over me, replacing the despair. It was the clarity of a new operating system coming online that prioritized survival over submission. I looked at Reed. His eyes were dark and intense, challenging me to step off the ledge. I ripped the envelope in half. The sound of tearing paper was sharp and satisfying. I tore it again and again until the confession was nothing but confetti. I opened my hand and let the wind carry the scraps down the street, mixing with the gutter trash where they belonged. "I am not going to turn myself in," I said, my voice steady, and dropped an octave. "Good, Reed," said a shark-like grin spreading across his face. "So what is the play?" I pulled my phone from my pocket. I am going to execute a hostile takeover. I did not wait for his response. I opened a secure messaging app and typed a text to Jace. I did not use capitalization. I did not use punctuation. I used the language of fear. I know Mom plans to pin money laundering on you if I go to jail. I have the recording of her telling the lawyer, "You are the fall guy, bring me the server access codes or we go down together." I hit send. My thumb hovered over the screen. The wait was agonizing. 1 minute, 2 minutes. The logic was sound. Jace was a coward. He feared prison more than he feared our mother, but he was also unpredictable. My phone vibrated violently in my hand. I looked at the screen. Incoming call, Jace. I answered by putting the phone to my ear without saying a word. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to fill it. Sloan, his voice was a wet whisper, trembling with terror. She said she would protect me. She promised. She lied, I said simply. I need the root access to the mainframe, Jace. Tonight. There was a pause, a ragged breath, then the sound of surrender. Meet me at the loading dock at 4 a.m. I will get you in, but you have to promise to keep me out of it. I looked at Reed, who was watching me with a mixture of pride and anticipation. I did not promise Jace anything. I hung up the phone. The game had changed. I was no longer playing defense. I was the hunter, and the labyrinth was mine to command. The boardroom of the Prescott Hotel was designed to intimidate. The long mahogany table stretched like a runway toward the chairman's seat, where my mother sat framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city she believed she owned. The room was packed with shareholders, board members, and legal counsel. The air was thick with the murmur of uneasy alliances. I stood outside the double oak doors, checking my reflection in the glass panel. I was not wearing the gray suit of a servant today. I was wearing black, tailored, sharp, and severe. I adjusted my cuffs. Beside me stood 2 agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and a forensic auditor from the bank. I nodded to them once. It was time to correct the error. I pushed the doors open. The conversation inside died instantly. 40 heads turned. My mother stopped mid-sentence, her hand frozen in the air. She looked impeccable in her mourning black, a single diamond tear brooch pinned to her lapel. Her eyes widened first in shock, then in fury, but she composed herself quickly. She smiled a tight, condescending expression that did not reach her eyes. "Sloan," she said, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "We are in the middle of a vote. If you are here to beg for an allowance, you are too late. Security, please escort her out." I walked past the security guard, who hesitated. He saw the badges of the men behind me and wisely decided to inspect his shoes. I walked to the head of the table and stood at the opposite end facing her. I placed a single folder on the table. The sound of it hitting the wood echoed like a gunshot. "I am not here for money, Mother," I said, my voice projecting clearly to the back of the room without shouting. "I am here to clarify a discrepancy in the financial records before the board votes on your appointment as CEO." Arthur Archer stood up, his face pale. "This is highly irregular. Miss Prescott has no standing here." "Sit down, Arthur," I commanded. My voice had the weight of authority that stopped him cold. He sat. I turned my gaze back to Patricia. "I need to ask you one question for the official minutes. Just one. And I want you to answer it under the penalty of perjury, as the acting fiduciary of this company." Patricia laughed a brittle sound. "This is ridiculous. Ask your question, child, so we can move on." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. "Mother, standing here before the portrait of grandfather, do you affirm that you have absolutely no knowledge of the $5 million in loans taken out against the company assets in my name? Do you deny any involvement in the creation of the shell companies in the Cayman Islands?" The room was silent. Every shareholder was looking at her. She saw the trap, but she thought it was a bluff. She thought I was the same obedient girl who stole champagne to buy her medicine. She believed her own narrative. She sighed, shaking her head with theatrical sadness. "Sloan, I do not know what madness has seized you. I have no knowledge of your illegal activities. I did not know you had done such terrible things until the audit. I am heartbroken, but I had nothing to do with it." The stenographer typed every word. The lie was recorded. It was now a legal fact. I smiled. It was the first time I had smiled in weeks. It was not a warm smile. It was the satisfaction of a mathematician solving a complex equation. "Thank you for confirming that on the record," I said. "Because if you did not know about the accounts, then it would be impossible for you to explain this." I nodded to Reed, who was standing quietly in the corner by the audiovisual controls. He pressed a key. The large projection screen behind my mother descended. The lights dimmed. The video was grainy, but the resolution was high enough. It showed a woman sitting at a kitchen table surrounded by sheets of paper. She was holding a pen, practicing a signature over and over again. The camera zoomed in. The signature she was practicing was mine. The audio filled the room. It was Jace's voice from behind the camera. "Mom, you are going to get caught. That does not look like her handwriting." The woman in the video looked up. It was Patricia. She sneered at the camera. "It does not have to be perfect, Jace. It just has to be close enough for the bank. Sloan is a ghost. No one looks at her signature. Now shut up and pour me a drink." The video cut to a split screen. On the left were the bank transfer records showing money moving from the Prescott accounts to the Cayman shells. On the right was a log of IP addresses authorized by Patricia's personal laptop executing the transfers. The boardroom erupted. My mother stood up, knocking her chair over. "That is fake. That is a deep fake. She manipulated it." She looked around for support, but the shareholders were recoiling from her. The illusion was shattered. The logic of the evidence was undeniable. I watched her disintegrate. The poise, the elegance, the mask of the grieving daughter all melted away, leaving only a frightened, greedy woman who had underestimated the daughter she tried to destroy. The agent stepped forward, moving with practiced efficiency. "Patricia Prescott, you are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft." They cuffed her hands behind her back. She began to scream, screaming that it was a mistake, screaming that I was ungrateful, screaming for Jace to help her. But Jace was not there. He was in a holding cell at the district attorney's office, trading his testimony for a reduced sentence. As they dragged her past me, she lunged, trying to bite me like a cornered animal. I did not flinch. I watched her leave the room with the same detached observation I used to inspect a room for dust. The variable had been eliminated. The equation was balanced. 12 months later, the office of the CEO looked nothing like a mausoleum. I had removed the heavy curtains and the dark wood paneling, replacing them with glass and steel. Natural light flooded the space, illuminating the clean lines of my desk, where a single stack of files sat perfectly aligned. The hotel was running at 98% occupancy. The debt had been restructured. The name Prescott, once synonymous with scandal, now stood for efficiency and transparency. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Callahan is here. Send him in." Reed walked in. He looked different too, less like a shark, more like a partner. He placed a small velvet box on my desk. "Happy 1-year anniversary of the hostile takeover," he said. I ignored the box and slid a check across the desk. It was written for the full amount of the bridge loan he had provided plus interest. "Paid in full," I said. Reed picked up the check and whistled. "You are an efficient Sloan. I will give you that. So what happens now? We are square. You do not need me anymore." I looked at him. He was right. Logically, the transaction was complete. But logic also dictated that a strong alliance was a valuable asset. I stood up and walked around the desk. "I am hungry," I said. "And for the first time in my life, I am not paying for dinner with stolen leftovers." Reed smiled. "Italian, acceptable." As we turned to leave, my assistant entered holding a white envelope. It had the stamp of the federal penitentiary. "From your mother, Miss Prescott. She says it is urgent." I took the letter. I felt the weight of it. I could imagine the words inside. The guilt trips, the manipulation, the pleas for money or forgiveness. It was a chaotic variable trying to re-enter my system. I walked over to the shredder in the corner. I did not open the envelope. I fed it into the machine, watching the white paper turn into ribbons of meaningless confetti. I did not feel hate. I did not feel sadness. I felt nothing but the quiet hum of a well-ordered life. I checked my wrist. The cheap plastic watch was gone, replaced by a Cartier tank, a subtle reminder that my time was now my own. It was 5 o'clock. The workday was done. "Ready?" Reed asked, holding the door open. I walked through the door, leaving the office, the shredder, and the past behind me. "Yes," I said, stepping into the corridor. "I am ready." If you are hearing this and feeling a heavy weight on your chest whenever your phone rings with a call from home, you need to listen closely. Have you ever been told that family means sacrificing your future to fix their mistakes? Have you starved yourself just so they could feast? That is not duty, and that is not love. That is exploitation disguised as tradition. You must understand that sharing DNA does not give anyone the license to destroy your financial or emotional well-being. It is okay to say no. It is okay to demand to see the receipts, and it is okay to walk away from people who only value you for what you can provide. Do not wait for a crisis to realize your worth is not measured by how much pain you can endure. You are not a safety net for toxic behavior, so please trust your instincts, check the facts, and choose your own peace because you deserve a life that belongs entirely to you.